Thank you everyone for coming. My name is Matt. Today we're going to be talking about Envoy, not the project. We'll talk just very briefly about it, but really about the story of how it came about, and I think what has made it a successful open source project. Let me see. Right. So just super briefly, again, I'm not going to spend a huge amount of time talking about the project, but for those of you that don't know, Envoy is a network proxy. It is in the cloud native space. We'll talk about the history, but it came out in 2016 from an open source perspective, and the project's goal is to make the network transparent to applications. And as I talk about in most of my talks, we spend a lot of time working on distributed system infrastructure, but most of that time, at least from the perspective of the business programmer, is mostly overhead. We would like our application programmers to actually spend their time working on applications. So at a super high level, and again, if you're not familiar with the project, I would encourage you to go watch some of my other talks or talks by other folks. The goal of Envoy is to have a network proxy that is out of process and handles a bunch of distributed system networking concepts at a base layer. So I don't normally spend a bunch of time in these talks talking about myself, but I think for this type of talk, it's actually worthwhile to talk a little bit about me and my background. So I have about 20 years of experience working on operating systems, virtualization, networking, fairly low-level stuff across a variety of different companies. But the biggest thing to understand about me is that my background is almost entirely in proprietary software development. I had done obviously the patch here and there to an open source project. I think I have a single commit in the Linux kernel, yay. But my background is mostly as a mercenary developer working for companies doing closed source software development. So Envoy was really my first experience with open source. And this is like winning the lottery on the first try. So the reason that I bring this up is that as I go through what I think are some of the things that made the project successful, I'm approaching this from a perspective of not that I have 20 years of experience doing this. Like most of this, I feel like I learned as we were bootstrapping the project. So you can take that for what it's worth. And again, just a lot of learning about open source during this time, and that's most of what this talk is going to be about. So, I think a lot of people approach open source and, they say if they've never done a bunch of open source, this is going to be amazing. We're going to make a project and we're going to put it out there. It's going to be super fun. Not quite. The last 2 or 3 years have been both the best years of my professional career and also the most difficult by far, and we'll talk about that more. But open source is not all fun and glory, particularly when you're a maintainer. So there's lots of fun parts about it, particularly if you have a successful project or you're lucky enough to have one. But some of it is quite painful, and that's just the reality of the ecosystem that we live in. So I want to take you just through a brief history of the Envoy project before we go into some of the details. The first commit of Envoy was actually back towards the beginning of 2015. So we're now over 4 years into Envoy history. I started the Envoy project at Lyft. This is based on some of my experience working at other companies, including Twitter, EC2. And so I've been working in distributed system networking for about 10 years at this point. So we started the Envoy project at Lyft again, and the idea there is we thought that we could build something that would be useful to Lyft. At the time that we started the project, I did intend to open source it, mainly because I didn't want to go to another company and build the same thing yet again. So I think that's a common case of why people want to do open source, and we'll talk about motivation later. But that's how it all started. So Fast forward, to the end of 2016. So this is a year and a half of development when we first open sourced Envoy. In that year and a half, we had deployed Envoy to all of Lyft. So at that point, Envoy was Lyft's edge proxy, taking all of the edge traffic. We had 100% coverage service mesh. I don't remember how many services we had at the beginning of Envoy and how many at the end, but probably a 10x growth at that point in terms of number of services. But a ton of development. And I think one of the key takeaways from that year and a half, at least from an open source perspective, particularly an open source project that wasn't started by an infrastructure vendor, is we were building that product for customers internal to Lyft. So at the time that we open sourced, Lyft probably had 150 or 200 developers. And that product was being built for internal use and used every day by 100 developers. So there was a real product vision, in terms of making that happen. Do you have a question? Yeah, go ahead.
If you're going to cover it later, that's fine.
Yeah, go ahead.
A little more technical. What is something that HA proxy could do or Nginx could do?
So the question is, what is Envoy versus Nginx or HA proxy? Just in the interest of time, I'm not going to spend a huge amount of time on that because that could be the subject of an entire talk. But just at the 40,000 foot view, and we'll talk a little bit about, I think, why it's different later. But Envoy, it focuses a lot more on, I would say, reactive cloud native deployment models. So auto-scaling environments, things like Kubernetes containers, I think that's where it's been a little bit different. But hold that question briefly, and I think we'll talk a little more about it. But again, so in that year and a half, we've been developing it internally, and at the end of 2016, I think we decided it's time, right? Like, let's actually go through and let's get this out there because there's no time like the present. And I remember, at that time frame, I thought to myself, wow, wouldn't it be amazing if we got one of Lyft's peer companies, whether that be like a Slack or a Stripe or something like that? Wouldn't it be amazing if we actually, got them to use Envoy? So I remember I went out and I did a little release, like pitch show where I went and talked to a bunch of people, and reaction was quite nice. And universally, the answer that I got at that time was, "This is great. I think we'd love to use this. We can't redo all of our networking, so come talk to us in 1 year," which is pretty reasonable in hindsight. So tail between my legs, we went back, and I was a little sad and said, I don't know if anyone's going to use this thing, but let's just open source. So let's fast forward. This is me in 2017, and this is what I looked like through most of 2017. And what happened between open sourcing at the end of 2016 and this point in 2017 is things went absolutely bonkers. And what happened at the time of open sourcing, which is very interesting in hindsight for an infrastructure project like this, is that smaller companies like Lyft didn't have the resources to invest in replacing their HA proxy or their Nginx or something like Envoy. But what did happen is companies like Google and Apple and Microsoft and a bunch of other larger companies immediately came out of the woodwork and saw a bunch of the potential in Envoy. And again, we'll go into what that is. And they were all over the project very quickly. So a lot of immediate interest in adoption for some of the bigger companies, bigger vendors. So that was interesting, and that was not what I expected. But at this time, I wrote most of the code initially Envoy myself. Probably at the time of open source, I had written 90% of the code myself. We had a team of probably 4 people that was working on Envoy at Lyft and operating Envoy across Lyft. So at the time of open sourcing, I was doing all of these jobs. I was answering questions. I was fixing bugs. I was going out and giving talks and meetups and all of these things. And it was a very intense time. And what also happens during this time frame is that when venture capitalists sniff out a new and exciting project, they tend to glom on. And I would say in the venture capital community, there's a subset of the venture capitalists which are pretty tapped in. They're pretty technical. They might be there early. But as a project becomes more and more successful, gets more and more buzz, there's a big herd of FOMO VCs that then start glomming on. So by the beginning of 2017, the project had really been blowing up. We'll talk about why. The VCs were coming in and really, getting to the point of harassment of trying to get me to quit Lyft and start a company and make money somehow with this thing. And I'm still trying to work at Lyft. I'm trying to, answer all these questions, fix all these bugs, grow the maintainer ranks. And 2017 was a tough year. And again, we're going to talk about this more. At the end of 2017, we decided to join the CNCF. CNCF had approached us early in 2017 to join. It didn't seem super compelling. But at the end of 2017, the project was getting to the point where there were many things that we needed help with, which are not coding tasks, whether those be marketing or PR or legal or et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I was having a hard time, getting that support from Lyft. So by the end of 2017, just from an open source program perspective, CNCF and some of the resources that the Linux Foundation could provide, it seemed like a useful thing. So we made the leap and we joined at the end of 2017. At the end of 2018, we became a graduated project. At that time, I think there was Prometheus and Kubernetes. So, a pretty top tier section of projects. And I think by that time, we'll go into some of the people who had become adopters in only 1 year of being open source, but pretty wide adoption. And now, in 2019, the adoption of the project is really absolutely astounding. I mean, I sometimes cannot believe what has happened in such a short period of time. So, and really the subject of this talk is I got to thinking of why has this happened? I mean, I think there's a bunch of learnings here because we've gone from, open sourcing in the end of 2016 to now, about 2.5 years later, and this is just a tiny subset of the adopters. It is incredible. We have adoption in all of the major cloud providers. Almost all of the unicorn-style VCs have adopted Envoy. We have tons of companies that are building products on top of Envoy, so it's become a platform. We have, so from platform to end users to public cloud, the adoption has just been incredible. So, the question is why? And I think that's where this becomes kind of interesting. Because I think a lot of times, people talk about code, and there are certainly code and technical details in terms of things like performance and reliability and like a modern code base. But I think as we've seen in the software marketplace, having a quality product, whether that be something that works, it's only half the battle, right? There are many quality products that are amazing from a technical perspective, but they don't see wide adoption. So, super clearly, there's a lot of other factors at play. And I'm going to get into what I think some of those other factors are right now. Some of the things that I think has made Envoy a very popular product, and there's some open source learnings here. One of them is that Envoy is a very extensive platform. And from an extensibility perspective, I think at this point, we have 10 or 12 or 15 different places where you can hook Envoy and build different filters and stats providers and logging implementations and on and on and on. And the reason that I bring this up is not really to talk about the specifics of a network proxy, but more to talk about, I think, one of the only ways of scaling and surviving from an open source perspective is through extensibility. Because when you're bombarded with issues, right, you end up having to either say no, take a bunch of functionality that maybe the project might not want at its core, and that becomes a very complicated thing. And I think what we have done is we have tried to almost never say no. We say no a lot for the core code, but instead we reframe the question and we say, I don't want to say no, but I want to get extensibility that allows you to go solve your own problem. And I think there's a lot of learnings here, again, from an open source perspective, because you have a limited number of maintainers. You're trying to build a general product. And if you try to accept every PR, not only will the project become out of control, but you'll just never win, right? So the core is extensibility. Or sorry, one of the core things that I think projects have to do to succeed in this space is to become extensibility. The next thing, and this is partly because Envoy was born at Lyft, where we operated it for a year and a half before open sourcing. I think as we've moved to a world in which most software that people use, particularly in the infrastructure space, is open source, people care about operability. They care about stats and logging and tracing and how easy is it to debug the system. Again, there can be incredibly powerful and amazing software out there, but things do go wrong, and if you can't understand what's going wrong, that software is not going to become popular. That's just a fact. So I think at its core, for any set of open source software, whether that again be in the logging or metrics or tracing or however you want to allow people to observe and introspect, super important to focus on that. So now let's talk about config. And this actually gets into your question before, which is what is the key differentiator in this space between Envoy and something like HA Proxy or Nginx? One of the things that Envoy did from a very early on, and again, I won't have time to go into details. I've given a bunch of other talks on this. Envoy has a very powerful configuration API that allows a system of envoys. I'm not going to use the word service mesh because it's very buzzy, and Envoy is used in a variety of different scenarios. But it allows a group of envoys to be controlled by a central control plane using a well-specified API. In the first version of the API, we use JSON with JSON schemas. In the version 2 of the API, we use gRPC and protobuf. But this API has become incredibly powerful, and this is with extensibility and quality and a bunch of other stuff. This is, I think, is the main technical reason that Envoy has become so popular. Because what we've seen is Envoy used in a mind-blowing array of different scenarios. I mean, again, from public cloud to startups to private enterprise to all of these things. And I actually remember that when we open sourced with the first REST API, I remember some initial issues that were opened, and people asked, why didn't you use X API, or why didn't you use Z API or something like that? And what we found is that the APIs that we provided were relatively simple, easy to reason about. They were eventually consistent, and immediately people started writing adapters for them for all kinds of systems. And again, what you find here is that in order to decouple your control plane or your platform where you're deploying software from that piece of software that you're trying to target, like Envoy, there already needs to be this abstraction layer for this API. And this API does that and allows Envoy, again, to be used with Kubernetes or Console or Mesos or on-prem or whatever, right? So this API has been incredibly powerful. Now, for most of this talk, though, this is actually the big reason. So again, we've talked about a lot of technical reasons that Envoy has become popular. But really, I think the reason that Envoy has become so popular in the last 2.5 years is really our community. And that's how I'm going to spend the rest of this talk, is talking about how we built this incredibly large community at this point, where we've gone from me very close to burnout and total meltdown in the middle of 2017 to now we have a sustainable set of maintainers, a huge array of contributors. I think our last release, we do releases every 3 months. I think we had 150 contributors. For a piece of software like Envoy, C++, low-level networking, it's pretty astounding. I mean, it's an amazing amount of contributors. We see random people on Slack answering people's questions and all of these things. So it's like, how do we do this? How do we go from me being that bottleneck to now we have this community that does all this stuff in 2.5 years? And that's what we're going to talk about. So, the first thing, and this is what we were talking about before, is I think everyone has different motivations in terms of why they're doing open source. And what I typically counsel people when they're about to do open source, because it's about to get painful if people are serious about it, is it's important to be clear about why you're doing it, right? And maybe there's a few people at this conference that truly believe in free and open software, but honestly, it's mostly bullshit. Like, people do open source for a reason. They do it because they want to become famous. They do it because they want to make money and they want to sell some infrastructure or something like that, right? Like, there's like 4 people in the world that are not lying if they actually don't tell you that. So, from my perspective, I already told you I wanted to open source Envoy because I was tired of doing the same thing at multiple companies. I didn't want to do it again. I thought it was an interesting way to grow my career. I thought I hadn't done it before. Let's give it a shot, right? But what I counsel people again is, when you're about to do open source, be honest about it, because your management probably has different motivations. Your management wants to do open source because they want to use it for recruiting, or they want to be seen as a, quote, serious tech company or something like that, right? So very important for everyone to be honest, and the motivations don't have to be the same, but if you don't be honest about it, it's going to become a problem. And what I tell people is that, again, lots of people talk about open source in terms of the technical aspects, but it is like starting a startup. It's going to involve blood, sweat, and tears across marketing and PR and fundraising and things that you probably don't really care about. And if you're not serious about doing it, the problem with open source is that it can be a net negative, right? If you put an open source project out there and it does not get traction and you don't maintain it, it's worse for your org, because you're still going to be dealing with a bunch of issues that get open, people that are claiming that you're, placing abandonware on the internet, right? So it's, unfortunately, open source is not let's throw it out there and let's see if there's traction. If you don't do it well, you're actually gonna come out behind. So what I tell people is that if you're gonna do open source, and this is the way that I approach most things in my professional life, I'm out there to win, right? And winning means adoption. It doesn't necessarily mean making money, but it means adoption. But what that means is that, in my opinion, if we're going to do a project and we're going to, quote, win, the non-technical factors, the community factors, they weigh extremely heavily, because, again, you can have an amazing technical project, but if you don't do all of these things that we're about to talk about, you will not win, and someone else will win, and then you're going to have a project that's out there. It's going to be hard to maintain, and that is unfortunate. So, first things first. This is my be nice slide, and really, I'm completely serious about this. And I actually mean it. And what I mean by be nice, and I'm not going to harp on particular open source communities, but what I'm going to say here is that the biggest learning that I have found from open source is that the tone of the community, how the community interacts with each other, it starts at the beginning and it starts from the top. And I'm proud of many things with Envoy. I'm very proud. But the thing that honestly makes me the most proud is that I have been told by many people that, they had sworn off open source, particularly infrastructure open source, until they came and they work with Envoy, and we treat each other well, and we have a respectful community, and they love contributing and a bunch of other stuff. And again, there's cases both ways. But that makes me feel great, and it also makes me understand that the tone, the way that you communicate in issues and PRs, being respectful to people, I call it the nice sandwich, where you always start by saying something nice and then give some constructive feedback and then end by being really nice, right? And these are super subtle things where, as you build your communication style for the project, these things are very impactful on how the larger community grows, because people emulate the communication styles of those that came before. And there's a herd mentality in humans in terms of how they communicate. So this is just it is incredibly important. So, and I'm proud of what we did here, which is, even as the rate of incoming PRs and bugs and inquiries, all of these things came in, I'm proud of how we were able to build this community, to again be respectful in terms of how we talk about things, how we make decisions. And this is so critical for getting new contributors and maintainers and people who are going to scale the project. So for me, going from 2017, where I had written almost all the code and was answering all of the questions, in order to get to the end of 2017, where we have incredible contributors from Google and Apple and Square and all kinds of companies, you have to make the community open for them, and you have to make it so they want to contribute, and it is really, really, really important. The next thing, and this is particularly true, from an infrastructure software perspective, is that a lot of people that work in open source and infrastructure software, they think about the code, they think about technical things. But the honest reality is that we live in a market-driven society where people will go, and the minute that blog post goes up, they're going to look at the web page and they're going to say, there is that first impression. It's like you're going to buy a product, right? And it doesn't matter what's inside it, if it is the most amazing piece of software that ever existed. If that web page has no logo or a bad logo, or there's a bunch of typos, or it looks like the project wasn't taken seriously, these are things that are super important. So just don't discount that first impression. And again, this is something that I think we did really well with Envoy. I remember that before we open sourced, I took a very exciting docucation where I spent literally 2 weeks at my house writing documentation, and not very fun. But the thing is that when you open and you do this first Medium post and you get out there and you get that first view of people don't sit there and look through the code. They look at the documentation. They look at that logo and they look at it and they think, is this a serious endeavor, right? And it is very important. So, and again, that comes back to copywriting and logos and documentation, all of that stuff. Take it very, very seriously, because it really, really does matter. The next thing that I would generally tell people is, the importance of doing things out in the open, right? And this sounds obvious. So we're doing open source, but people actually get this wrong, and it has severe implications for building that larger community. What that means is that typically open source these days is that it started within a company. That might be a for-profit venture-backed company. It might be a company like Lyft. But the reality is that, if you're trying to build a larger community, you have to do things in the open. You have to have design discussions in the open, in a public Slack or a public email list. You have to track issues and proposals in the open, right? And all of these things, in terms of fixing issues and building features, they should be incrementally done in the open. And these are, it's just, again, it sounds obvious, but these are things that are not done. And again, I'm not going to name names, I'm not going to go into details, but one of the reasons that Envoy really won here in a short period of time against some of its competitors is because of this. Some of Envoy's competitors, only today, because of Envoy, are now doing things out in the open. Previously, some of Envoy's competitors, you would do a pull request effectively. They would say, oh, we're going to look at it and run a bunch of tests in some back room, and we'll get back to you in a couple of weeks or something like that, right? And the way that people do modern software now, that's not acceptable. People want to see CI running on GitHub. They want to see the code review process on GitHub. They want everything to happen on GitHub. And this, it really matters. Everything has to be done in the open. And the last thing that I would say is that for those of you that are not a VC startup, but are at a different company and are trying to do open source, sometimes people do what I call the reverse merge, where they do most of their development internally, and then occasionally they'll reverse merge a snapshot of that code out to open. And that might mean dumping a giant feature, which is like 20,000 lines of code out there. Or it might mean, just like dumping an entire release, right? And again, this is not conducive to building an active community. Because if the community believes that all of the software development is done inside the company, they're going to feel like they have less say on what happens. And again, this talk is not about naming names, but there are many projects that to this day at major companies that still do this, and it is detrimental to building that larger community. So again, all of this stuff, to me, it seems very obvious, but it's not taken very seriously, and I think it's very important for when you build that community. So let's talk about PR and marketing. I think it's very easy to make fun of Twitter. I have a love-hate relationship with Twitter. I worked at Twitter, by the way, and I mostly hate Twitter, but I'm on there all the time because it's my job, and that is what is frustrating about it, is that having an online persona in this side of social media, some people find it obnoxious that this is what is required these days to have something be successful. But the reality, like it or not, is that the vanguard of the thought leadership, this is where it happens, right? And that thought leadership, I'm using air quotes here, that's what percolates back over the next 5 or 10 years of what software people are going to use, right? So, if you're trying to have a new project, you're trying to get it out there, you don't necessarily have access to big corp bucks, to do PR and marketing, this is where it happens, and it's important to actually get out there and have a presence and engage in that conversation, because that's, it's important for project success. Same for blogs. So, since we started Envoy, I've done a lot of blogging, and I think that's been very popular. That also gets to people. Meetups and conferences, that's why I'm here talking to you. Although most of the talks that I did in 2017 and 18 were stumping for Envoy from a technical perspective. Now the project has become so successful that there's other people giving those talks, and I'm much more interested in giving this talk. But I don't discount how many meetups and conference talks and other things that I did in 2016, 17, and 18 to get the project to where it is today. It really does matter. And again, these are things that scoff at it if you will, if you want, but these things matter, right? Like all of these things, these non-technical PR, marketing, blogs, like logos, how pretty things look. People see this and they think about, whether the project is serious or not. So let's talk about business model. This is obviously a ripe area of discussion. I'm sure it's being talked about at this conference. It's certainly talked about a lot these days in terms of open source business models. We obviously see a lot of venture-backed companies now who are, open source first companies and are trying to make money from open source. I could talk for a long time about this, but I'm not going to derail this talk on business models. But one of the things that I do want to talk about is, at least to bring this back to Envoy, is that one of the reasons that Envoy, I think, has become incredibly popular and has built that larger community is because we do not have a premium version. We are not open core. I have written blog posts about this. Again, I'm not going to completely harp on this, but one of the things that I think is that as people are trying to figure out how to make money from open source, one of the observations that I have is that open core, and for those of you that don't know, open core is loosely the idea that you have a open source core and then you have a paid set of features, is that open core is often at odds with building an active community. Because the problem is that the community will want to come in and give you a feature, and that might be something that you offer in the paid version. And then now you have a conflict of interest. And again, not to name names, but this again is one of the reasons that Envoy has been very successful, because compared to Envoy's competitors who are mostly open core solutions, we take every reasonable feature, and most of those are paid features in the competitor solutions. So there are lessons to be learned here. And what that means, again, is that we can make what I call technology first decisions. That means that we don't have to worry about, is this feature going to cannibalize some business model that we have made, right? And that has been incredible for us. But what we have done, and this is the kicker, and this is, again, I don't have enough experience to know if this is applicable to other projects or where it is, but what we've done here, and this is what I think has been the rocket ship of Envoy's success, is because of the extensibility, because of the APIs, because of all these things, we have built an ecosystem of people that are making money on top. They're having control planes, they're having value-added services, they're having all these things that people pay for on top. And what we find is that we have competitors that collaborate on the data plane. We have cloud vendors who do PR reviews for each other, and companies that compete with each other. They all collaborate on the open source, because we've all implicitly agreed that, this is how we are going to make money. Or sorry, we're not going to make money on the data plane. We're going to make money on top. But the downsides of this is that funding can be complicated, right? Like, we're not a VC-backed company. So when it comes to who pays for CI, the current and endless bane of my existence, it is complicated, right? Because there's no clear person or group of people to go pay for that. So that's tough. And the other thing is management can be complicated, because now we're doing this across a bunch of different people. There's no clear central control. All right. So super quickly, in terms of just burnout, I already talked to you about 2017, my tough experience there. And like I said, a very successful project is no different than an early stage startup just completely blowing up. And if that happens, you got to get on the rocket ship or get off, right? And it's a bunch of hard work. And scaling contributors and yourself is the only way to do it. And see my notes on being nice. That's honestly what it comes down to. With that said, and I'm going to talk about this briefly, is that burnout is a very real problem, right? And burnout's a problem because in the industry, we still have not figured out properly how to pay for open source. Open source is big business, but it's unclear how do you pay people to work on the boring nuts and bolts of maintainership. And this is an ongoing conversation within the industry. It's tough, and there's no good solutions. And this comes back to conflicting expectations of day job versus open source and managing expectations. So anyway, thank you. And just to recap, why Envoy? I think, again, it's been a technically solid project. Great job with extensibility, API driven, no open core or paid version. And it's really been all about our community. So thank you very much. I think I have 1 or 2 minutes for questions. So thank you.
Sorry. If you have questions and you're able, please come up and ask them into this microphone so everyone can hear you on the video too.
Hi, Matt. Yeah, I just have a quick one. Could you share a little bit like how Lyft internally value the success of Envoy? Because it's different than yours.
Yeah, that's a great question. There are no good answers here. I mean, because the problem is that success is very subjective, right? Because, like I said before, from Lyft's perspective, Lyft is thrilled about Envoy for a couple of reasons. It's been great for recruiting. It helps establish Lyft as a serious tech company, right? Like, these are the reasons that people do open source. It's been very popular there. But how do you quantify that? How do you actually look at the recruiting numbers and try to figure out who came there because of Envoy, right? Or how do you quantify people taking Lyft seriously as a tech company, right? So you can talk about Envoy as a product, how has it been useful at Lyft, but even there, how do you quantify the outages that we didn't have because of Envoy? So it's virtually impossible. So I think this is an ongoing conversation that people need to figure out, and it's tough. I think, yeah. So I think unfortunately we're out of time, but I'm going to stick around here or in the hall. So if people want to chat about stuff, I'm happy to do that. Thank you again. Thank you.